Years later, people would remember Elvis Presley for the lights, for the screaming crowds, for the sold-out concerts, for the voice that made millions of people stop and listen. But one of the most important moments of his life happened somewhere no one expected. No stage, no cameras, no reporters. Just a dark city street, an old guitar, and a frightened boy whose voice nobody seemed to hear. That night, Elvis could have kept driving. He could have told his driver to turn up the radio. He could have ignored the sound coming from the sidewalk. But he didn't. And neither Elvis nor that boy knew it yet. That decision would change the boy's life forever. The night had started like any other. Elvis sat quietly in the back of his car, watching the city pass through the window. Streetlights flashed across the glass. Cars moved through the intersections. People hurried along the sidewalks. Everything was loud. Everything was moving. Then Elvis heard something beneath the noise. A guitar. Not a beautiful guitar. An old guitar. One of the strings was slightly out of tune. The wood sounded tired. Then came a young voice. Thin. Unsteady. But strangely powerful. Elvis lifted his head. "Stop the car." The driver looked at him. "Here." "Yes." The car pulled toward the curb. Elvis looked through the window. Under an old street lamp sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. His clothes were worn, his shoes were old, and the guitar in his hands looked like it had survived years of being dropped, repaired, and played. But the boy didn't seem to care. He wasn't watching the people passing by. He wasn't counting the money in front of him. He wasn't even looking for applause. He was singing, as if he had something inside him that had to come out. Elvis opened the door. "I'll be back," he told the driver. Then he stepped onto the sidewalk. Nobody noticed him. For once, Elvis Presley was invisible. He walked closer. The boy's voice cracked. He stopped, looked at the guitar, adjusted one of the strings, then continued. Elvis listened carefully. The boy wasn't perfect, but perfection wasn't what Elvis heard. He heard pain, he heard hope, and most of all, he heard someone who refused to give up. When the song ended, Elvis slowly sat down beside him. "Hello." The boy looked over. "Hi." Elvis pointed at the guitar. "That's a good guitar." The boy looked down. "It's old." Elvis smiled. "Old doesn't mean bad." The boy ran his fingers over a deep scratch. "It was my father's." Elvis's smile faded. "Your father gave it to you?" The boy shook his head. "He died." Silence. Elvis looked at the guitar again. "How long have you had it?" "I don't know." "You play it every day?" "Almost." "Why?" The boy shrugged. "Because it was his." Elvis nodded. Then he noticed something in the boy's expression. "Does your mother know you're out here?" "Yes." "Does she like you singing?" The boy looked away. "No." "Why?" For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, "She cries when I sing at home." Elvis's expression changed. "Why?" The boy stared at the guitar. "She says I sound like my father." Elvis didn't interrupt. The boy continued. "She isn't angry at the music." "Then what?" "She's scared." "Scared of what?" The boy's fingers tightened around the guitar. "That I'll end up like him." Elvis lowered his eyes. He understood. The boy wasn't just carrying a guitar. He was carrying his father's memory. And his mother was terrified that the same dream would take her son away too. Elvis looked at him. "Do you still want to sing?" The answer came immediately. "Yes." "Even if your mother doesn't want you to?" "Yes." "Why?" The boy stared at the strings. His voice became almost a whisper. "Because when I don't sing." He stopped, then looked up. "I don't know where everything inside me is supposed to go." Elvis froze. For a moment, the city disappeared, because he knew exactly what the boy meant. Long before the fame, long before the crowds, long before anyone knew his name. Elvis had also been a young man with nothing but music and a dream. He had known what it felt like to have something burning inside him that nobody else could understand. Elvis reached toward the guitar. "Can I see it?" The boy handed it over. Elvis turned it slowly in his hands. The scratches, the worn wood, the damaged strings. "This guitar has been through a lot." The boy gave a small smile. "So have I." Elvis laughed softly. "Fair enough." He handed it back. "Play something." The boy looked surprised. "Now?" "Now." The boy began. A simple melody. Elvis listened. When the boy finished, Elvis smiled. Again. The boy laughed. "Why?" "Because I want to hear it." The boy started again, and then Elvis joined him. The boy suddenly stopped. "You sing?" Elvis smiled. "A little." The boy laughed. They started again. 2 voices, 1 old guitar, 1 quiet sidewalk. For a few minutes there was no superstar, no poor child, no crowd, just music. People began stopping. 1 man stared. Then a woman. Someone whispered. "Is that?" Another voice answered. "That's Elvis Presley." The boy's fingers suddenly stopped. He slowly turned. He stared at the man beside him. "You're Elvis Presley?" Elvis nodded. The boy's eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elvis smiled. "Because if I had told you," he glanced toward the crowd, "you would have been talking to Elvis Presley." He looked back at the boy. "I wanted you to talk to me." The boy stared at him. "But you're famous." Elvis laughed softly. "I wasn't always." The boy shook his head. "I can't imagine that." "You don't have to." Elvis looked toward the street. "There was a time when nobody knew my name. Was it hard?" Elvis thought for a moment. "Very." "Did you ever want to quit?" Elvis looked directly at him. More than once. The boy lowered his eyes. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Elvis smiled. "Because something inside me wouldn't let me." The boy looked at his guitar. "I wish I had that." Elvis shook his head. "You do." The boy looked up. "How do you know?" Elvis pointed at the guitar. "Because you're sitting on a sidewalk with a broken guitar." He paused. "Singing when nobody asked you to." The boy said nothing. Elvis leaned closer. "That's not weakness." His voice became firm. "That's strength." The boy swallowed. "What if I never become famous?" Elvis shook his head. "Don't promise me you'll become famous." The boy frowned. "Then what should I promise?" Elvis looked him directly in the eyes. "Promise me you won't quit." The boy went silent. He looked at the guitar, then at Elvis. "I promise." Elvis smiled. He reached into his pocket. The boy immediately said, "I don't need money." Elvis stopped. "Who said anything about money?" The boy looked at his hand. Elvis laughed. Then he pulled out some cash. The boy shook his head. "I can't take it." "Why?" "My mother says we shouldn't take things from strangers." Elvis smiled. "Your mother sounds smart." He placed the money in the boy's hand. "This isn't for you." The boy looked confused. "What is it for?" Elvis pointed at the guitar. "New strings." The boy looked down. "I don't have money." "You do now." "Why?" Elvis smiled. "Consider it an investment." "In what?" Elvis looked at him. "In you." The boy didn't know what to say. Elvis stood. He looked down at the boy one last time. "One day, you might stand on a big stage." The boy listened. "People might know your name." He pointed toward the street. "They might even forget the boy you were tonight." Elvis paused. "Don't let them." The boy nodded. "Why?" "Because you need to remember where your voice came from." Elvis started walking away. Then the boy called after him. "Mr. Presley!" Elvis stopped. "Will I really make it?" Elvis turned around. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "I don't know." The boy looked surprised. Elvis smiled. "But that's the reason you have to find out." He turned away again. Then added, "A real singer isn't someone who sings when everyone is listening." He looked back. A real singer is someone who keeps singing when nobody is. Elvis disappeared into the crowd. The boy sat there alone. He looked at the money, then at the old guitar. He placed his fingers on the strings and began to sing again. But this time, his hands weren't shaking, because something had changed. For the first time in his life, someone had heard him. Not his mother. Not the people walking past. Not the strangers who ignored him. Elvis. And that was enough. The boy didn't know it yet. But years later, thousands of people would gather to hear his voice. And before he sang his first note on one of the biggest stages of his life, he would tell them about this night. The night Elvis Presley stopped. The night a broken guitar became a promise. And the night a frightened child heard 4 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Promise me you won't quit." The next morning, the boy woke before sunrise. For the first time in a long time, he didn't wake up thinking about everything he had lost. He woke up thinking about one sentence. "Promise me you won't quit." He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the old guitar. For years, it had been a reminder of his father. Now it meant something else. It was a reminder that somebody believed he could become more than his circumstances. He quietly left the house. The music shop had just opened. The owner looked at the damaged guitar and raised an eyebrow. "That thing has seen better days." The boy smiled. "Can you fix it?" "Of course." The owner replaced the strings, adjusted the neck, and repaired the loose tuning peg. When he finally handed it back, the boy played one chord. The sound was completely different. Clear. Warm. Alive. The boy smiled. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Where did you get the money?" He turned. His mother was standing in the doorway. His smile disappeared. "Mom." She looked at the guitar, then at him. "Where?" The boy lowered his head. "Someone gave it to me." "Who?" He hesitated, then quietly said, "Elvis Presley." His mother froze. For several seconds, she said nothing. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not." "Elvis Presley?" The boy nodded. His mother slowly sat down. "What did he say to you?" The boy looked at the guitar. "He told me not to quit." His mother closed her eyes. For years, she had believed that stopping the music would protect him. She had already lost her husband. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her son to the same dream. But now she realized something painful. Maybe the music wasn't what was hurting him. Maybe taking it away was. She looked at him. "Play." The boy stared. "What?" "Play for me." He sat down. His hands trembled. Then he began. His mother listened. And within seconds, tears appeared in her eyes. The boy stopped. "I knew it." His mother shook her head. "No." She wiped her face. "I'm not crying because I'm afraid." She looked at him. "I'm crying because I finally understand." The boy said nothing. His mother smiled through her tears. "Your father didn't leave you a curse." She touched the guitar. "He left you a voice." That sentence stayed with the boy. From that day forward, everything changed. He practiced every morning, every afternoon, every night. When other children were outside, he played. When the weather was terrible, he played. When people laughed at him, he played. When an audition rejected him, he played. When someone told him he wasn't talented enough, he played. And whenever he thought about quitting, he remembered Elvis, not the superstar, not the famous singer, the man who had sat beside him when nobody was watching. Years passed. The boy grew taller. His voice grew stronger. His fingers became faster. But the road was not easy. There were nights when he came home exhausted. There were mornings when he stared at the guitar and wondered if Elvis had been wrong about him. Maybe he wasn't special. Maybe he had only been lucky enough to meet a kind stranger. Maybe his dream was impossible. But every time that thought appeared, another voice answered it. Don't quit. He began performing in small clubs. At first, only a few people came. Sometimes the room was half empty. Sometimes nobody applauded. Sometimes people talked while he sang. But he kept going. Then something changed. People started returning. They started requesting his songs. Then they started bringing friends. His name appeared on small posters, then larger ones. His mother watched from the audience whenever she could. She no longer saw her husband's shadow when her son sang. She saw her son's future. Eventually, a manager discovered him. "You have something," the manager said. The young singer smiled. "What?" "I don't know yet." "Then why are you interested?" "Because people stop talking when you sing." That was the beginning. The small clubs became theaters. The theaters became concert halls. And eventually, he was offered the biggest performance of his life. Thousands of people, television cameras, reporters, music executives, everyone who mattered would be watching. Backstage, the young singer stood alone. His hands were shaking. His manager walked in. "You ready?" He looked at the old guitar. "I don't know." The manager laughed. "You're ready." The singer shook his head. "No." He touched the scratches on the guitar. "I've never played for a crowd like this. You've played for thousands before. Not like this. What's different?" The singer looked toward the curtain. "This time," he paused. "I know why I'm here." The manager didn't understand. Before he could ask, the stage manager called. 1 minute. The lights went down. The crowd began roaring. The sound traveled through the walls. The singer closed his eyes. For a second, he was 12 again. Back on that sidewalk. Back under that weak street lamp. Back beside the old guitar. Back beside Elvis. Then the curtain opened. He walked onto the stage. The audience exploded. Thousands of people stood. He reached the microphone. And then, he didn't sing. He simply stood there. The applause slowly faded. The room became quiet. The singer looked at the crowd, then at his guitar. Finally, he spoke. "Before I sing tonight," his voice trembled, "I need to tell you about a man." The audience listened. "A long time ago, I was just a kid." He smiled faintly. "I had an old guitar." A pause. "I didn't have money." Another pause. "I didn't have connections." His eyes became wet. "And I had no idea where my life was going." The crowd remained silent. "One night, I was sitting on a sidewalk playing that guitar." He looked down. Nobody cared. His voice became softer. "Then someone sat beside me." He swallowed. "He didn't ask me how much money I had. He didn't ask me who my family was. He didn't ask me whether I was talented. He simply listened." The room was completely silent. "Then he told me something." The singer took a breath. "He told me not to promise that I'd become famous." He smiled through his tears. "He told me to promise that I wouldn't quit." The audience began to understand where the story was going. The singer looked toward the ceiling. That man was Elvis Presley. The room erupted. Thousands of people stood. Applause thundered through the hall. But the singer raised his hand. Slowly, the crowd became quiet again. "I wish I could tell you Elvis knew what I would become." He shook his head. "He didn't. He didn't know whether I'd succeed. He didn't know whether I'd fail. He didn't know whether I'd ever stand on this stage." He looked at the old guitar. but he believed I deserved the chance to find out. Silence. That's why I'm here. He lifted the guitar. Not because I'm the greatest singer. Not because I became famous, but because I kept a promise. His voice broke slightly. I promised a man who believed in me before anyone else did that I wouldn't quit. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Then he smiled, and I didn't. He placed his fingers on the strings. The first chord filled the hall, and something extraordinary happened. Nobody screamed. Nobody shouted. Nobody moved. They simply listened. Every note carried the memory of that street. Every word carried the pain of the child he had once been. Every chord carried the promise he had made. And backstage, his mother watched with tears in her eyes. She remembered the boy who had once been afraid to sing in front of her. Now thousands of people were silent just to hear him. The song ended. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the entire hall rose. The applause was deafening. The singer stood completely still. He looked at the crowd, but he wasn't really seeing them. He was remembering someone else. A man sitting beside him on a sidewalk. A man who could have kept driving. A man who had no reason to stop. A man who had simply heard a voice and decided it deserved to be heard. The singer looked down at his guitar, then whispered, "Thank you, Elvis." The crowd couldn't hear it, but he didn't need them to, because that thank you wasn't for the audience. It was for the man who had changed his life without ever knowing how far his kindness would reach. And that night, after the concert ended, the singer returned backstage. He opened an old case. Inside was a small black and white photograph. Elvis Presley, sitting beside a young boy, on a sidewalk, with an old guitar between them. The singer touched the photograph and smiled, because the world knew Elvis Presley as a legend, but he remembered him differently. He remembered him as the man who stopped. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change someone's life. One person stopping. One person listening. One person believing. But there was still one thing the singer had never told anyone. Something that happened the night Elvis walked away. Something the boy had kept secret for years. And if he had known what that moment would eventually mean, he might never have let Elvis leave that street. Because before Elvis disappeared into the crowd, the boy had asked him one final question, and Elvis's answer would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Will I really make it?" Elvis had looked back and said, "I don't know." Then he smiled. "That's why you have to find out." The boy never forgot those words, and years later, standing beneath the brightest lights of his career, he finally understood what Elvis had really given him. It wasn't money. It wasn't fame. It wasn't a promise of success. It was something far more powerful, a reason to keep going when success wasn't guaranteed. And the story wasn't over yet, because the final chapter would reveal why the singer had carried that old guitar for his entire life, and why, even after becoming famous himself, he refused to ever replace it. Years had passed since that night. The boy was no longer a boy. He had become a successful singer. His face appeared on magazine covers. His songs played on the radio. Thousands of people knew his name. He had performed in theaters, arenas, and some of the biggest concert halls in the country. He had money now. He had fame. He had everything the frightened child on that sidewalk once believed he could never have. But there was one thing he never changed: the guitar. The same battered guitar his father had left behind. The same guitar Elvis had held under that streetlight. The same guitar that had survived years of performances, repairs, and travel. People often asked him why he kept using it. One reporter once laughed and said, "You can afford any guitar in the world. Why are you still carrying that old thing?" The singer smiled. "Because this guitar remembers something my success never will." "What?" He looked down at it. Where I started? The reporter thought that was the whole answer. It wasn't. The truth was much deeper. The guitar reminded him of the night when nobody knew his name, the night when he had no future, the night when his mother was afraid for him, the night when he almost believed his dream was selfish. And then Elvis had appeared, not as a superstar, not as a legend, just as a man who had heard a child singing and decided to sit down. That memory never left him, and neither did the promise. I won't quit. Then came the night of what would become one of the most important concerts of his career. The venue was enormous. Thousands of people had gathered. Bright lights covered the stage. Cameras were ready. Reporters waited. His manager stood backstage. "You ready?" The singer looked at the old guitar. He ran his fingers across the scratches. "Almost." His manager smiled. "You've performed in front of bigger crowds." "I know." "Then what's wrong?" The singer looked toward the curtain. "Nothing," he smiled. "I'm just remembering." "Remembering what?" The singer didn't answer, because he was remembering a street that had changed everything. The stage manager called, 30 seconds. The lights went dark. The audience erupted. The singer closed his eyes, and suddenly, he could hear it again. That old guitar, that broken string, that young voice, his own voice, before the fame, before the money, before the applause. Then he heard Elvis's voice in his memory. "Promise me you won't quit." The curtain opened. He walked onto the stage. Thousands of people stood. The applause shook the building. He reached the microphone, but he didn't sing. He simply stood there. Slowly, the noise faded. People began wondering what was happening. The singer looked across the audience, then at his guitar, and finally said, "Before I sing tonight, I need to tell you about someone." The hall became silent. "Most of you know me because of my songs," he smiled. "But you don't know the reason I kept writing them." He paused. "I was a child once." His voice softened. "I had an old guitar." He lifted it slightly. "This one." The audience watched. I had no money. I had no record deal. I had no future anyone could see. He looked down. I used to sit on a sidewalk and sing because I didn't know what else to do. A few people smiled, but the singer didn't. Then one night, a man sat beside me. The hall became completely silent. He didn't know me. He didn't know whether I'd become anything. He didn't know whether I was talented enough. He didn't promise me success. His eyes began to shine with tears. He just listened. The singer took a breath. And then he told me something. He looked toward the ceiling. He said, his voice cracked, "Don't promise me you'll become famous. Promise me you won't quit." Silence. Then he said the name. That man was Elvis Presley. The crowd erupted. Thousands of people stood. Applause thundered through the hall. But the singer raised his hand. Slowly, the audience became quiet. I wish I could say Elvis knew what would happen to me. He shook his head. He didn't. He didn't know if I'd succeed. He didn't know if I'd fail. He didn't know if I'd ever perform in a place like this. He looked at the old guitar, but he believed I deserved the chance to find out. A tear rolled down his cheek. And sometimes, he paused. That's all a person needs. The audience was silent. Not money, not fame, not a guarantee. Just someone who says, he smiled through his tears, "I believe you can try." He looked at the guitar. That night, Elvis gave me money for new strings. The audience laughed softly. He called it an investment. The singer smiled. I thought he meant the guitar. He shook his head. Years later, I realized he meant me. The hall became silent again. He placed his fingers on the strings. I promised him I wouldn't quit. He looked around, and I kept that promise. Then he began to play. The first chord wasn't perfect. The second wasn't perfect either. But the audience didn't care, because the song wasn't about perfection. It was about survival. Every note carried the pain of a child who had lost his father. Every chord carried the fear of a mother who had been afraid to lose her son. And every word carried the promise made beneath an old streetlight. The song ended. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. Then the audience rose. Thousands of people stood together. The applause became enormous. But the singer wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the old guitar. He whispered, "I kept my promise." Then he looked toward the empty space beside the stage. "And I hope you knew." The audience couldn't hear those words, but he didn't care, because they weren't meant for them. They were meant for Elvis. After the concert, the singer returned backstage. Everyone wanted to congratulate him. Managers, reporters, friends, photographers. But he quietly walked past them. He entered his dressing room, closed the door, and sat alone. He opened an old case. Inside was a black and white photograph. It showed Elvis Presley sitting beside a young boy. An old guitar rested between them. The singer touched the photograph. He stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. He remembered everything. The street, the conversation, the promise, the moment Elvis walked away. And suddenly he remembered something else. Something he had never told the public. That night, after Elvis had walked away, the boy had sat there for several minutes without moving. He had looked at the money, then at the guitar, then toward the direction Elvis had disappeared, and he had whispered, "I won't quit." He had been 12 years old. He had no idea how hard that promise would become. He had no idea how many times life would test it. He had no idea how many failures would come. But he kept it. And perhaps that was the real miracle. Not that the boy became famous, not that he stood on a giant stage, not that thousands of people knew his name. The miracle was that a single conversation had given a frightened child enough courage to survive the years when nobody believed in him. The singer eventually put the photograph back into the case. Then he lifted the old guitar. He looked at it carefully. It was damaged. It was scratched. It had been repaired many times. But he smiled. A new guitar could sound better. A new guitar could look better. A new guitar could cost more. But none of them could tell his story. So he never replaced it. Not because he couldn't afford to, because he didn't want to forget. And that became the lesson he carried for the rest of his life. Success doesn't erase where you came from. It makes remembering even more important. Because there will always be a moment before anyone knows your name. A moment when the dream feels impossible. A moment when you are sitting alone with something you love, wondering whether it's worth continuing. And sometimes, the person who changes your life isn't the person who gives you everything. Sometimes, it's simply the person who stops, the person who listens, the person who sees something inside you that you can't see yet, the person who says, "Keep going." That was what Elvis gave that boy. Not a career, not fame, not certainty, belief. And perhaps Elvis never realized how powerful that gift was, because the world remembers Elvis Presley for his music. But that boy remembered him for something else. He remembered the night a legend chose to sit beside someone who was still unknown. He remembered the man who could have driven past, but didn't. He remembered the voice that told him not to quit. And years later, when the boy himself became successful, he carried that lesson to every stage. Whenever someone asked him what success meant, he never talked about money. He never talked about awards. He never talked about fame. He said, Success is being able to look back at the person you were before anyone believed in you." He paused, "and knowing you didn't abandon him." That old guitar remained with him until the end, and whenever he touched its worn wooden body, he remembered the boy he once was, the boy who sat alone, the boy who was afraid, the boy who didn't know whether his voice mattered. And he remembered the man who stopped. Elvis Presley. Maybe Elvis forgot the boy's face. Maybe he never knew what happened to him. Maybe he never knew that his few minutes on that sidewalk would echo across an entire lifetime. But the boy never forgot Elvis, because Elvis had given him something that money could never buy. He gave him permission to believe in himself. And sometimes, that is the greatest gift one human being can give another. Not, "I promise you'll succeed," but, "I believe you're worth trying." The lights eventually went out. The audience went home. The cameras stopped recording. The applause faded into silence. But the old guitar remained, sitting quietly in its case, waiting for the next morning. And beside it was the same black and white photograph, a famous man, a forgotten boy. One sidewalk, one guitar, one conversation, one promise. I won't quit. And maybe that was the most beautiful part of all. Elvis never needed to know how the story ended, because the moment he stopped that night, the story had already begun. A child had been heard. A dream had been given a chance. And somewhere beneath all the fame, all the lights, and all the noise, a simple truth remained. Sometimes you don't need someone to change your lifa.***. Sometimes you only need someone to believe in you long enough for you to change it. YOUSELF.***.